we're wrapping up our sermon series on Nehemiah, and I love talking through this book, and I'm kind of sad to see it go because I love the history of it and the leadership lessons and all the heroic nature of it. But as excited as I was to preach this sermon series, I think there's actually a member of my family who was more excited for it, and it wasn't actually Melissa. I think the person who was most excited for this sermon series on Nehemiah was my mom. And some of you have met my mom. She comes occasionally. She actually works at a different church, and so she can't always come here. So she wasn't excited about Nehemiah for the sermon content. Actually, my mom was really excited for the sermon series on Nehemiah because when I was a kid, I was in this little play musical thing at church called Oh Me, Oh My, Oh Nehemiah. And so she got to share lots of embarrassing photos with everybody she could find in church. So we're just going to go ahead and get those out of the way and off the table. I had an awesome tunic and this great headband, and I'm not quite sure about the sandals, but we're just going to go with it. But it was something that I'd kind of blocked out of my memory successfully. Like I'd forgotten this play from fourth grade until she brought it back up, and then I had that memory flooding back in of that moment right before the first act. I remember this just enough of this play because I remember this one part where right before curtain comes up at the very beginning of the play, that feeling as we began to get ready to walk out on stage for the first time. And some of you know this feeling. Some of you know what that looks like. You've practiced for something. You've prepared. You've done everything you can to get ready. And as you begin to walk out for the first time, or step up for the first time, or speak for the first time, you begin to get that feeling inside you of like excitement and sheer terror kind of mixed together. Anybody ever have that feeling? Maybe you get it when you speak a little bit, maybe just in some area in life. There was that moment for me as I began for the beginning of this play, as I got ready for the beginning of this play, of great anticipation. It was that moment where I wasn't sure what was going to happen. Was I going to give in to the fear and run away and not say my lines and hide in the bathroom? Was I going to step up fearlessly and take part in what I was supposed to do? What was I going to do in this moment of great anticipation when we began our play in fourth grade for the very first time? I think we've all felt moments like that moment. I think we've all had moments in our life of great anticipation, moments where it's a hope-filled fear or it's a fear-filled hope. It's a moment where we're not sure what's going to happen next. Are we going to step back or are we going to step up? For some of you kids, it's before your first recital. It's before you step out for that play yourself for the first time. It's that moment where you get to start your soccer game or your first debate tournament. Those moments where you've prepared and you've practiced, but now it's showtime and you're not sure what's going to happen. As you get older, it's the feeling you get as you step onto the high school campus for the first day of your freshman year, or a few years down the road as you leave your parents' house. You say for good, but let's be honest, you'll be back 2 weeks later, right? For college, for a career. That time that you wrestle, am I excited? Am I terrified? It's that feeling that you'll find right here during a wedding. As couples look deeply into each other's eyes and as they try to mumble out words and repeat vows and forget their own names as they get married. And they wrestle with that mixture of sublime joy and maybe just a little bit of abject terror. Some of you can resonate with that. It's that feeling that we get later in life as we leave behind homes. We leave behind security and what we're used to move to new opportunities, new locations, new cities, and to start over. That mixture of joy and fear, anticipation and terror. It's that feeling that you get, that you can hear in the voice of someone who stands up to give the toast at the wedding of a little sibling, or perhaps a child. It's that feeling that people get as they walk out of the school or the office or their career for the last time and walk into the scary, new, exciting, and terrifying thing we call retirement. There are places in all of our lives, sometimes frequently and sometimes spread far apart, where all of us wrestle with this mixture On one hand is fear. On one hand is joy. And we have to ask ourselves, are we prepared to step back or step up? Will we give in to the fear, or are we going to respond fearlessly? In the business world, they talk about this a lot. There's this book that came out a couple years ago by a guy named Jim Collins, and he talks about how one thing that every organization needs is a big, hairy, audacious goal, right? Big, hairy, audacious goal, great name for something. And he talks about how every single organization needs some goal so big and so out there in such a stretch that you feel a little bit of excitement at the possibility, but everybody around you begins to doubt you. Or at least maybe the critics begin to wonder, are you going to be able to pull this off? Is this going to actually work? He talks about how every organization, one thing they need is a big, hairy, audacious goal. Things like JFK's goal at his inaugural address to in the next decade, land a man on the moon and return him safely to the earth. Something that inspires people, but at the same time, well, it leaves you a little terrified too, right? We have these moments in our life where we begin to ask ourselves that mixture of fear and excitement, and we begin to wonder, are we going to step back or step up? Here at Tonganoxie UMC, we're actually moving into one of those right now. For the past few weeks, we've been studying the book of Nehemiah as we approach our own Nehemiah moment. But we're going to leave our comfort zone, leave what we know and what is safe, what is easy, to do what is necessary to build a place where all people can come into God's presence. We're going to add a new service time, change all of our service times, add new service opportunities, new growth opportunities, new learning opportunities, because we believe this is what God's calling us to do. Now, some of you feel completely safe. Some of you feel a little bit of that mix of excitement, but also fear. Just that tinge of that big, hairy, audacious goal. And we've planned and we've practiced. We've done everything we can to prepare and get ready. And here we stand. Bless you. Bless you. There's about 9 more coming. Bless you. We've done everything we can to get ready. As a church, we're in that moment of great anticipation. Next week is that moment where we ask ourselves, are we going to step back or step up? Now, Nehemiah experiences this time and time again. He has these audacious moments, these moments of great anticipation sprinkled throughout his story. His whole story is really one story of a big move, of big leaving of comfort and big rebuilding of a city, but really he has a lot of little moments too where he has to consider, is he going to step back or step up? It starts for Nehemiah when he's living in the king's palace. It's 445 BC, 445 years before the birth of Christ, and Nehemiah is living in the palace of Susa. It's a veritable paradise on earth. And his job is to sample the king's wine before the king drinks it, and so his job is really easy, really comfortable, right? He lives in a palace, he drinks wine for a living. This seems like a pretty good job. This is Nehemiah's existence, and it's comfortable. And then God calls Nehemiah and says, hey, I want you to leave all that comfort behind. And I want you to go to Jerusalem, the city far away, the city that's been broken down and is in ruins. And I want you to build it as a place where all people can come and experience God's presence. Nehemiah has to wrestle, am I going to step back or step up? It's the question that he wrestles with as he goes before the king and says, hey, I know I have a really great job and I spend a lot of time around you. I want to stop doing that and go do something that doesn't sound as exciting. Is Nehemiah going to step back or step up? It's the feeling he gets as he goes in front of the people of Jerusalem for the first time and says, I know you've been living here, but we're going to rebuild this thing. And he begins to unpack this vision in front of people. Can you imagine having to unpack that vision and say, we're going to put this back together as a place where all people can come into God's presence? Do you think he wrestled, are we going to step back or step up? It's the question he wrestles with as opposition begins to mount, as people even begin to try to kill him, as disagreements happen around him. Time and time again, Nehemiah understands how we feel when we face those moments in our life where we ask, are we going to step back or step up? Are we going to give in to the fear, or are we going to rise up fearless? what gives Nehemiah the courage to respond the way he does? What do we learn from Nehemiah? What can we learn from Nehemiah that might apply to our own lives, to us as a church as we undertake this great thing? I think we actually see a little bit of what works for Nehemiah and these builders and how they celebrate. It doesn't seem like it at first because their celebration's kind of tame. We actually read about their celebration in Nehemiah 6, 15 through 17, and it just reads like this. They actually get to the point where they rebuild the wall and they finish their big undertaking, and they've done all of this, and this is how they announce victory. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul. It took 52 days, period. And then the story just moves on. Like, that's it. That's their complete declaration of victory. I'm thinking I might have been a little more enthusiastic if we just finished this great, huge undertaking. Nehemiah's his record of all of their success is kind of tame. It's like if you ask your friend, what'd you do this weekend? And they go, well, it was a pretty laid-back weekend. I watched some football. I went to the store. I got married. I mowed the lawn. It's like, hold up a sec. Like, we got to go back to this thing, man. Like, this is what's happening in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah needs to learn that it's okay to, sometimes celebrate a little bit, right? Side note, just because I think it's really interesting. 25th day of the month of Elul. Some of you might know this. The Hebrew calendar is actually solar, not lunar. It's different than our calendar. And so Elul is this month that kind of floats differently based off of where, the cycle of the moon is. But it's actually typically normally mid-August to mid-September. They think in 445 BC that the month of Elul was right about now, and actually that the 25th day of Elul was probably next week or the week after that. That these people undertake this great thing and they finish it right about the same time that we're launching this new service. I just think that's cool. Nehemiah and his people, they celebrate rebuilding the wall in this really tame way. They just barely announce it. And finally, they get around to what we read and what Grace read in our scripture later. This moment that doesn't seem like a celebration for most of us, but actually gives us some hints into what gets them to the point where they're ready to celebrate. Their celebration shows us what gave them the strength and the courage and the conviction to step up instead of stepping back. It just doesn't look like a party. It actually looks more like church. See, they gathered together, and this is the scripture that Grace read. They gathered together, everyone in the whole city, out front of the water gate in Jerusalem. It's this big gate that they've just rebuilt, and it's right across from the temple. And they gather everybody in this big open area plaza. And everybody stands up, and this guy gets up to read, and his name is Ezra. And he rolls out this big scroll. It's the Torah scroll. And he begins to just read passage after passage. And we don't actually know how long he read, but it talks about him reading for hours, day after day after day. To me, that doesn't sound like a big celebration, like somebody reading Genesis just for 4 hours straight, 7 days a week. Anybody else going to sign up for that? Really excited for that? That doesn't sound like a big party to me, right? But Ezra begins to read from the first 5 books of the Bible, from Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And he reads these stories of times where God has called people to leave behind their comfortable areas, their comfortable lives and their comfort zones, and to go on great journeys, and God is with them, and God does great things through them. Ezra begins to read the stories of the Old Testament and about the times where people at the end of long journeys hear that voice from God that says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Ezra reads the scripture, and then Ezra sits down, and these other guys get up, and these are the Levites. And they're the guys that Grace read that have all the really confusing, difficult names. I'm really excited. I think next week there's not going to be any difficult names. You should sign up to read scripture next week. But these guys, they get up, and they begin to speak. And their job is to explain what was just read. Their job is to make sure everybody understands it and everybody's on the same page and everybody gets it. Their job is kind of like what we think of as modern pastors, or at least what I see my understanding of what I'm doing right now. My job is to make sure that we dive into this as deep as we can and we understand what this means for our lives and how this plays into our lives and how our lives fit into that broad stream of history. These are sermons the Levites are giving. They remind people about the stories in the Bible and how God works in human existence, sometimes through human beings, and how we fit into that story, because that story's not done yet. Now, for some of those who were listening, this was a story that they knew well. This was a story that had sustained them time and time again, not just through this rebuilding period, but through their whole lives. These were people who saw themselves as links in a chain stretching back to the very beginnings of humanity. This was the hope they clung to when life got tough. Part of what enables us to step up is that memory. Part of what gives us the strength in the middle of the dark moments of our lives is to remember where God has already been at work in the world. Sometimes it's where God has been at work in our own past, in our own history, and we can point to times where it's like, I think God was with me there. I'm not sure how to explain it, but I felt God's presence, or I felt something was going on, or I knew that there was something that was different. Sometimes we look back in our own lives and we can remember where God was. Sometimes, though, we look back in history and we can see God's fingerprints sprinkled throughout all of history, sometimes in our scriptures. Sometimes in the people that God's called, like Abraham and David and Joseph. Those heroes that God carried through tough points. And we look at their story and remember how God works in our stories. Part of the way we step up fearlessly instead of stepping back is to remember that it's God who called us and God who steps up with us. I saw that a little bit this last week. I sat down with one of our elderly members, and she was facing some health issues. And we began to talk about where she saw God in her current situation. Really kind of deeper questions. Now, I'm pretty sure she's going to make it. She's not at the end yet, but as I was sitting with her, we began talking about end-of-life stuff. And I asked her, where's God right now, and where do you see God working in this? And I was in awe of this woman's faith by the way she responded. See, she's not excited to die, and she's not looking forward to dying. But at the same time, it became clear over the next several minutes of conversation that this woman has absolutely no fear at all of death. Her only concern was for a few friends and family that she left behind, that they would be okay. But as for herself, there was no fear in the face of something that leaves most of us terrified and afraid. Because she was looking back at all the places that God had been with her so far, and she knew that God would be with her still in that moment ahead. Sometimes looking back at where God has already worked gives us the courage to step up instead of stepping back. But that's just half of it. See, we don't just look back. We're also called to look ahead. As these people build the city of Jerusalem, they build it as a place where all people can come into God's presence, no matter their background or their baggage, no matter their history or their hurts. And so as they begin to build this city, they look ahead at the people who will one day enter into it, who will one day learn about God here, who will one day meet God here. They could not have anticipated it, but yet they build the city where 445 years later, bless you, a man named Jesus is going to gather together with a group of friends, and the 13 of them, including Jesus, are going to have a meal. And that meal is going to echo throughout history. They didn't know it, but the city that they're building is the city where a little bit after that, a man named Paul is going to come in, and he's going to get a commission. He's going to get a passion for launching churches, and he's going to build them throughout the entire Roman world, and those churches are going to change the course of history. They didn't know it, but they might have guessed it, that the city they're building is the city where their kids and their grandkids and the generations yet to come are going to learn about the God who loves them. This is what they're building when they build a city for all people to come into God's presence. Part of finding the internal resources to step up instead of stepping back comes from looking back to everywhere that God has been in our past, in our own lives or in the course of human history, as we see in Scripture. Part of it comes from looking ahead at where God is going in our world. This is why we're building a new service. This is why we feel called by God to step out on faith like Nehemiah, to leave our comfort zones. And as a church, to do everything necessary to build a place where all people can come into God's presence. This is why we're feeling that God has called us to lay the foundations for generations yet to come. Now, we've actually already seen this a little bit here at TUMC in our own fairly recent past. See, we're talking about millennia and millennia in the story of Nehemiah, but here, 147, almost 148 years ago, people got together fairly close to this spot and said, I think we need to build a church where people can come into God's presence. And they begin to gather, and they begin to meet. And that what started as a small group began to grow. And they built a place where maybe a long time ago, or maybe very recently, you came to worship. It's the thing that happened when people began to build this building. It's the thing that happened when actually a little over 3.5 years ago, people began to meet. At the time, our church had primarily one service. We had actually a smaller service as well, but most things were focused in our what was our 1050 service. And people began to meet and said, what would it look like if we built a place where people could come into God's presence that had a different style of music or a different type of worship? What would happen if we began to do everything we could to reach out to both our current traditional population and also contemporary population? And people began to meet, and they began to plan, and they began to do everything that it would take to launch this service. And I asked Kevin what that was like this last week, 2 weeks ago now, because I wasn't here and I wanted to know what conversations happened. And Kevin told me that shortly before the service launched, a couple people were sitting around one night. I'm not going to use any of their names. A couple people were sitting around one night, and somebody threw out there, what do you think it's going to look like? What's going to happen? And somebody thought, I wonder, what if maybe by Christmas there's 100 people in that 9 o'clock service? I mean, wouldn't that be crazy? I mean, at the time it didn't make sense, right? This church was nowhere big enough to be at the point where it needed 2 services for 100 people in it. It was this big, hairy, audacious goal. It was this thing that people began to look at, and actually they began to laugh at the guy who threw out the idea that there might be 100 people in this service by Christmas. Until it happened. And until his people began to find that this was a place that they experienced God. And for 3.5 years, this service continued to reach out. So did our 11 o'clock. And both began to be places where people could come and experience God's presence. And now, 3.5 years later, we're having to split this service to make sure that we always have room for people to come into God's presence. This was a laughable goal until it happened, because God does laughable things when people leave behind their comfort zone and step out in the way that God has called them to do. So here, I think, is how every single one of us are called to take part in the story of God's work. On the first week, I asked you to start thinking about somebody in your life who needs God's presence. Somebody, maybe a family, a friend, a coworker, somebody in your neighborhood who's just longing for hope and peace in their life. They might not even call it God. I found that for me, that's something that I know a lot of people that fits of. Someone who needs to know that there's a God in the universe who loves them and cares for them. I think one of the ways we leave our comfort zone and we follow the path of Nehemiah and we go and build a place where people can come into God's presence is to invite them. Simple task. But I want to challenge you to invite somebody to church. We don't always like to do that in mainline Christianity. Sometimes that makes us feel a little uncomfortable. Sometimes we've had bad experiences with that. We don't invite people because we want them to feel guilty or we feel like we need to make our church bigger. We invite them because we think that people need a place where they can come into God's presence. I want to challenge you to do that this week. I will be too. God calls each of us, like Nehemiah, to step out on faith. There are times where we're stuck in that moment of anticipation between the desire to step back and to step up. My prayer is that in those moments, may you, like the ancient Hebrews 2,500 years ago, remember where God has worked with people and walked with you and all of humanity, going back to the earliest days of history, where God has worked in the lives of people to make a difference in the lives of their neighbors. And may we look ahead at the places where we believe that God is calling us to work in the world for the generations who aren't here yet.